God's word. Immediately I was in the Spirit, and behold, a throne set in heaven, and one sat on the throne. And he who sat there was like a jasper and a sardius stone in appearance, and there was a rainbow around the throne, in appearance like an emerald.
Around the throne there were 24 thrones, and on the thrones I saw 24 elders sitting, clothed in white robes, and they had crowns of gold on their heads.
And from the throne proceeded lightnings, thunderings, and voices. 7 lamps of fire were burning before the throne, which are the 7 spirits of God.
Before the throne there was a sea of glass like crystal, and in the midst of the throne and around the throne were 4 living creatures, full of eyes in front and in back.
The first living creature was like a lion, the second living creature was like a calf. The third living creature had a face like a man, and the fourth living creature was like a flying eagle.
The 4 living creatures, each having 6 wings, were full of eyes around and within, and they did not rest day or night, saying, Holy, 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 Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come.
May the Lord bless the reading of his word. Please be seated as we go to sing.
Sing with me, will you? Seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you. Hallelujah, hallelujah. Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. Hallelujah, hallelujah. Ask and it shall be given unto you. Seek and ye shall find. Knock and the door shall be opened unto you. Hallelujah, hallelujah. Hallelujah, hallelujah. I love thy kingdom, Lord, the house of thine abode, the church our blessed Redeemer saved with his own precious blood. I love thy church, O God, her walls before thee stand. In on thy hand. Bifocals. Let's do the last verse together. Sure as thy truth shall last, to Zion shall be given the brightest glories earth can yield, and brighter bliss of heaven. Great is the is the Lord, he is faithful and true. By his mercy he proves he is love. Great is the Lord and worthy of glory. Great is the Lord and worthy of praise. Great is the Lord. Now lift up your voice. Now lift up your voice. Great is the Lord. Yeah, it's adorable. No, yeah, Pastor Eddie and I both say that. Okay. She knows it, that's the problem. Oh, I'll tell you what, I appreciate you putting up with me over there and them let me join. The worship team, John and Wayne and Bryn and the Jessicas and George, they make that look easy.
And the sound booth.
And, well, yeah, the sound booth, they make us sound better. It is not easy, and I'll tell you what, when it's a photocopy of one of the hymnal pages and it's that far away from me with bifocals, it's gone. So I blow things up really big up here, so anyways. That's good. Pray for John and Wayne. They're traveling vacation on the holiday here, and no one will be happier to have them back than me. And we'll look forward to that. I do want to just get you back into where we are. We're going to be in Daniel chapter 7 this morning. There's a reason why for 2 Peter kind of comes to an end after all of these things that we've considered from James to 1 Peter to 2 Peter. James, that there's hope in the midst of hardship, and 1 Peter, that you can rise above hardship. You don't have to be held by hardship. And then 2 Peter, now you can live in truth's power, the power of truth in your life. And there's a reason why Peter, after all these things, 2 things you have, right? You have victory, you have truth. 2 things you escape, destruction and bondage. And then 3 things that you are to be, patient and watchful and diligent. He ends there for a reason. He wants us, as we consider how we can, in the midst of all the chaos of the world, and we're going to see that in Daniel chapter 7 this morning, in all the chaos that exists among all the people of the world and all the nations of the world, we can live in truth's power by focusing on the reality of the truth and not being distracted by the times, by the present, by the stresses and the hardships and the storms of life. And we see that even in the text this morning. So we're talking really the umbrella of this, if you want to call it a mini-series, in the midst of the other mini-series, in the midst of the book of Acts, which is really where we're trying to get through. The unavoidable destiny. Again, there's a reason why God gives this to us. Some people will say, well, this is after the church. This isn't the Christian life. It's not about salvation. It's not about, your relationship with God directly, but it is. There's a reason why God gives this end times to us. He gave it to the nation of Israel. And I do want you we're going to back up from the book of Daniel in just a minute to understand and appreciate the 2 different languages that the book of Daniel was written into, and at least suggest one of the reasons why I think it's that way. And there are many out there that support what I say, so they're smart. No, I'm kidding. But again, there's a lot of debate that goes around these things. I don't want us to get so distracted with those things that we miss the picture. There's an unavoidable destiny that's coming. And in the midst of life's hardship, there are certain things that we can know, certain conclusions we can draw from this that enable us to live in truth's power. That's why Peter ends with these things. And in the midst of that, knowing what is to come, here's what we now can be. And that's where Peter's going to end when we get back there and finish that. Things to come. Unavoidable destiny. We talked about a new day coming, right? We talked about Jeremiah chapter 31, that there's a new covenant. This is for the nation of Israel. It's a covenant that was different than the Mosaic covenant, which was conditional. It was based on their obedience, their ability to obey God, to live according to his standards and his precepts, and they couldn't do it. The end result of the Mosaic covenant is almost the same as the end result of the new covenant. The promise was, if you obey old covenant, you will get. New covenant, because you didn't obey, I am going to give and you will get. It's the same get. What is that get? What do they get? They get to dwell in the land that was promised to them. They get a king that will rule for all of eternity. They will once again be a kingdom in the land.
and as a kingdom amidst the nations surrounding them, they will be at rest. Just that alone. I can look at current situation now and say with a surety, we are not in the millennial kingdom right now. And I say that for a reason, and none of you may struggle with this at all, but there are those out there that are teaching that we're kind of already in the kingdom. All these things are already passed. We're kind of in the kingdom. We're just waiting for everything to be kind of Christianized or kingdomized in order to prepare it to be ready for God to come, for Christ to return, second coming, which everybody knows is at the end. Well, everybody ought to know it's at the end of the millennial kingdom. We can't be in the kingdom right now because Israel is not at rest. They don't have a king on a throne who's eternal. They haven't experienced and received that. So a new day coming. It's a dwelling of safety. We also talked about dreams and kingdoms and beasts. This was 2 weeks ago. That's why I just want to go over it really quickly with you here. And the idea of inevitability. These dreams were not something that Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar and Darius and all of the rulers were experiencing, that were somehow their subconscious sorting out all the experiences of life they've already had. Before they had the Word of God in their hands complete, the revelation of God that we have. God in part used dreams and visions to communicate His revelation to them through prophecy and His prophets that were chosen. And He did it in part through dreams. Not dreams sorting out emotionally what's happened in the past, but dreams revealing to them God and His plan. I said it that way on purpose. Not just God's plan, but to reveal to them God Himself and His plan. And we talked about that in Daniel chapter 2 is where we were focused. And we talked about this great image. It was a dream that Nebuchadnezzar had. You remember, he talked about that dream, and he said with that dream, listen, I had a dream, bring all of the wise men together throughout all the land, all the magicians, all the sorcerers. You might have to stop and restart the PowerPoint. It'll start the second time. I don't know why it didn't start the first time. That was just a hint for back there, because, yeah, it's my fault, not theirs. So he calls all the sorcerers together. He said, look, if you can tell me the dream and give me the interpretation, then I'll spare your lives. But if you can't, you're all going to die. And they couldn't do it. And they said, look, king, if nobody can, you can't help. There's nobody in the land that can do that. And so he puts out a decree, and they start, his soldiers start going out and start killing all of the wise men throughout the land that they had not only gathered themselves as Babylonians, but even took from the nation of Israel, the wisest of them, in that first deportation out of the nation of Israel. So the guard comes along, he comes up to Daniel and his friends, and then they're like, what's going on? What's the urgency? And they explain it to him. He says, well, look, give us a day to pray about it. We're going to come to you, and we're going to ask God to give us an answer. And long story short, God does. God reveals to Daniel the dream and the explanation. And he comes to the king, he comes to Nebuchadnezzar, which at the time, Babylon, it's already taken over the world, and it's taken a portion of Israel out already and left there one in charge to kind of watch over the nation in a sense. And he begins to explain to Nebuchadnezzar. And we look at verses 29 and 30, and it talks about there's a great purpose that's going on here. In verses 29 and 30, in Daniel chapter 2. In verse 29, as you, O king, thoughts came to your mind while you were on your bed about what would come to pass after this, and he reveals secrets, has made known to you what will be. But as for me, this secret, it's not been revealed to me because I have more wisdom than anyone else, but for our sakes, who make known the interpretation of the king, and that you may know the thoughts of your heart. He said, the purpose of your dream, Nebuchadnezzar, is this. God desires to protect us, His chosen people, and to give you an understanding. That understanding will unfold all the way through the end of chapter 4. And the text itself doesn't give it to us, but at the end of chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar's done. And he's off the scene. Here he says, is the vision. This is the dream that you had, Nebuchadnezzar. And there before you is a great image. And this image has the head of gold. You saw it up there. It's this great big head of gold. That's you, king. And there's a chest of arms in silver. That's the nation that's going to come after you. And then there's the belly, the sides. That's of bronze. And that's going to come after that. And then it's going to have, and it has legs of iron and feet of iron and clay. Yet another nation that's going to rise up. That's the dream that you had. And then you saw this stone that was cut out by hands. And it was a stone that was thrown, and it struck the feet of this great big image. And that stone, after it struck the image, crushed the image, and it just crumbled and pummeled and became powder before us. And all of a sudden that stone just grew and it filled the whole earth. It took everything over. That's the dream, Nebuchadnezzar, that you had. Here's the interpretation of it, Nebuchadnezzar. Verse 37 tells us the God of heaven. And there he reminds him in verse 37 of Daniel chapter 2. You, O king, are a king of kings. For the God of heaven has given you a kingdom, power, strength, and glory. He said, look, there is a God in heaven who made you that gold head. You may be a king of kings right now, but there is one who is in authority over you who has placed you there. And then he goes on to describe in verses 38 through 43 all the kingdoms of the earth that will come. All of those kingdoms, the kingdoms that will be after you, that is the silver, the chest, the sides of bronze, and the legs that are of iron, and the feet and the clay, those are all going to be nations that will come after you. And every one that comes will have another one that follows. And each one will be crushing to the one that came before. We got to the end of chapter 2 realizing all of those things, and we drew just a few conclusions. Number one, the great God, verses 45 through 49, has been revealed. The whole purpose of this Nebuchadnezzar is to reveal to you and to the world God. Period. All the nations, they're going to come and they're going to go. Kings will reign, but God puts them there, and they come and they go. Nations are strong, nations are crushed, but God remains. And what you have dreamed and what I have interpreted, it will come. You can't stop it. And the message is true. The message is true. All of this, starting in verse 4 of chapter 2, was written in Aramaic. It was for the nation itself of Babylon. Daniel switched from the native Hebrew language of the Israelites to Aramaic so that the Chaldeans could understand what was being said. This was a message for the nations of the world. That Aramaic runs all the way to the end of chapter 7. At the end of chapter 7 and verse 28, the Aramaic is done, and he once again shifts back to Hebrew. Because from chapter 8 through the rest of the book of Daniel, the focus is Israel. This message, this portion, from 2 verse 4 to the end of chapter 7 in verse 28, this message is for the nations. Please understand, nations. God's focus is Israel here, but there's a message for you. That message is there is a God. He is in control. What he says is going to happen. Nations and kings will come and they will go. Peoples will come and they will go. But God remains, and his promise is sure. That was the dream. Today we want to look at Chapter 7, beasts. So we switch over in chapter 7 in time. And let me give you a little bit of background here so that we can get our heads a little bit into how the structure of the book of Daniel is working. Chapter 5 starts with Belteshazzar. He's a co-regent under Nabonidus. Nabonidus' cylinder archaeologically confirmed the fact that there was Belshazzar. And listen, Belshazzar was questioned for a long time. Even though Daniel called him king in verse 1 in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, there was a lot of question about who this Belshazzar was. And in archaeology, they found a cylinder because the actual ruler was Nabonidus. And they found a cylinder from him, and in part, that cylinder had mentioned the name of Belshazzar. And we found that Belshazzar was actually a co-regent that was put in place there in Babylon to help rule. It starts with Belshazzar, the co-regent under Nabonidus, both being descendants of Nebuchadnezzar. And it runs through his death and Darius the Mede taking over Israel by conquering. This is chapter 7. This is 14 years now before Daniel in the lion's den in chapter 6. Daniel in the lion's den runs through Belshazzar's reign, and then in chapter 7 he backs up and he wants to give more details. Again, he does this just like Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2. Genesis chapter 1, we have the 7 days of creation. Genesis chapter 2, Moses introduces then creation again, but in more detail in specific areas. The same thing is happening here in the book of Daniel. He ran through the history, and so in verse 28 of chapter 6, so this Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius, in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. So we've already gone through all of that, and we're all the way up to Cyrus. Now he backs up. And he wants to go back to Belshazzar. In the very first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream, this time his dream, and visions in his head while on his bed. And he wrote down the dream, basically the main facts. Kind of like, here's the outline of the events. So Nebuchadnezzar had a dream of a great image. Daniel interpreted it, chapter 2. Now Belshazzar begins his reign, and Daniel has a dream of beasts. Daniel writes the main points. He interprets them, or has them interpreted for him. And all of this concludes at the end of chapter 7. Both dreams are a different way of seeing the same events. And I want to parallel them for you in a global overview of all the nations of the world. Then at the end of chapter 7, Aramaic ends. Chapter 8, the Hebrew again focuses on the nation of Israel. So, let's get to chapter 7, verse 2, talking about, first off, the dream. Here's the dream. Daniel spoke, saying, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the 4 winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea, and 4 beasts came up from the sea, each different from the other. The dream starts with a great storm. It is a storm that is a significant storm. Now, they did call it, eventually, the Mediterranean Sea was referred to as the Great Sea, but that's not what's being referenced here. In fact, it doesn't fit the context if it was talking geographically about the Mediterranean itself. What it's talking about is something that is symbolic, because everything down through here is symbolic. And he's saying the winds are coming from above, first off. All of these winds are an unseen force, unstoppable. The earth itself is subject to its effect, and the effect itself is unavoidable on earth. Have you ever been in a windstorm? I remember one time driving through the mountain pass from Kenai Peninsula to Anchorage, Alaska. And Edie and I were going for a marriage counseling seminar up there. We had a number of people from our church that were going up. We couldn't go up as early as them, so we drove by ourselves. The rest of them were going to meet us up there. They left early. We should have. We got to the mountain pass, I think it was February, winter in Alaska. And we're driving through the mountain pass. And that particular mountain pass, going through the Chugach National Forest, is the most snowy area in Alaska, volume-wise. It's not a rare sight to drive through this pass and to see 20 and 30 foot high walls of snow on both sides. It just, when it snows there, it just dumps. And we were driving along on dry pavement, and within minutes, the car came to a stop and I couldn't move. The snow was so thick, I couldn't see. And I'm literally stopping in the middle of the highway. And I kind of edged my way up a little bit at a time, and I finally saw dimly some headlights in front of me. The snow was so heavy and the wind was blowing so hard, I couldn't see, I couldn't move. We're in a minivan. And the snow was already up over the running boards of the minivan and now starting to pack against the doors of the car. And we're just sitting there. What do? It was a snowstorm. We couldn't stop it. The wind just drove it. And everything on the earth just came to a stop. Fortunately, the people behind me did too. That's what I was nervous about, is some four-wheeled truck, big truck coming along that was trucking through the snow and wouldn't see us and wouldn't stop. But everybody came to a stop. Everybody in Anchorage, of course, that was before cell service was in the pass, and we couldn't call anybody, and everybody from our church that was up there was panicking because we were so late. But we survived, and they eventually dug us out. We got on the road and made it there again. But that's the idea of these winds. When he talks about this here, he says, look, these winds are intense. And these four winds come out of heaven from every direction. And it blows one way, and then it blows another, and then it comes across another way. And it doesn't seem like it's coming from anywhere, but the earth itself just has no power against it. And then he says there's a great sea. It's stirring up the sea. The sea can't stand still. All the inhabitants of the nations is what he's talking about. The sea of people, the sea of existence on earth, is all being impacted by what comes from above. Everything on this earth has no power against what God sends. We can't stop the wind or its effects. We can't prevent all of these things from happening. There's a wind from above, and the sea on earth is stirred. We go through life every day, and like Solomon says, one day comes, another day it ends, another day comes, the sun goes up, the sun goes down. Day after day things happen, and we can't stop it. We can't change it. Life just happens. And God blows the wind and things change. Even in driving up into Pennsylvania with the guys, there was a place, a farm that we passed where these trees were uprooted and fell down on top of this poor guy's house, and he was running the chainsaw and trying to clear it off, and the roof was caved in. We were powerless to do anything against it. Down south, tragically, all the tornadoes that have ripped through the south, and they can't stop them. They can't even predict where those tornadoes are going to go. And all the devastation that's caused by them, the flooding that's going on. That's the idea here. Life just goes on, but God's the one who steers it. The wind comes from above and disturbs everyone on earth. Now we can look at that sea and we can say it's either all of the people of the earth or it's all of the nations of the earth. It might be a little bit semantical there, but then he gets into all of these nations that he's talking about. And I can't help but think, even if it's talking about the sea of people, it is ultimately about all the rule on earth that can't change what God determines. And he says in verse 3, 4 great beasts come from the sea, each different from the other. great beasts. So here's Daniel having this dream, and he sees these uncontrollable, multi-directional winds that are coming, and it's tossing the sea of life wherever God chooses to toss it. And up out of the midst of all of the ways of life rise from the sea of people and nations these four representative beasts. This time not an image. He begins to describe them here. The first one, he says in verse 4, is a lion. The first was like a lion, had eagle's wings. I watched till its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the earth and made to stand on 2 feet like a man. And a man's heart was given to it. I don't know how many of you have seen eagles before. We, on the way home from the men's retreat, actually looked over to the valley and saw a bald eagle flying off to the right. And up in Alaska, we've seen a lot of those. Majestic creatures. And they fly effortlessly. It's as if there's something invisible that's air, wind, that's just holding them up. And they just go wherever they want to go. And they soar. And this lion that's described here is a lion with wings like an eagle. And that's the image that he's seeing in his dream. It just coasts and it glides and it goes wherever it wants to go until the wings are clipped. And down to earth it comes. And this beast that is roaring like a lion, that has overtaken the world and overlooks everything, all of a sudden is forced to be like a man. And stand on 2 feet with a heart of flesh. You know, it's interesting. It sounds a little bit like Nebuchadnezzar at the end, doesn't it? Wasn't it just a few chapters back? Nebuchadnezzar, back in chapter 4, verse 28. At the end of 12 months, verse 29 of chapter 4. He was walking about the royal palace of Babylon. The king spoke, saying, "Is not this great Babylon that I have built for a royal dwelling by my mighty power and for the honor of my majesty?" While the word was still in the king's mouth, a voice fell from heaven. Here's the king soaring over all of his land, the lion with wings, looking down at all that he had conquered and saying, "This is all mine." And a voice comes in. King Nebuchadnezzar, verse 31, "To you it is spoken, your kingdom's gone." Clip. And he got driven out into the fields, and he couldn't speak, and he acted like a cow, and ate grass for 7 years. I'd like to say it's one of my favorite passages in Scripture, but I say that all the time, don't I? Right? Why? Because at the end, verse 34, "At the end of the time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted up my eyes to heaven, and my understanding returned to me. And I blessed the Most High, and praised and honored him who lives forever. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom is from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing. He does according to his will in the army of heaven. And among the inhabitants of the earth, no one can restrain his hand. The four winds. Or say to him, what have you done? At the same time, my reason returned to me, and for the glory of my kingdom, my honor and splendor returned to me. My counselors and nobles resorted to me. I was restored to my kingdom, and excellent majesty was added to me. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, all of whose works are truth, and his ways just. And those who walk in pride he is able to put down. And that's the end. That's the end of the story of Nebuchadnezzar. Back to chapter 7. The lion, the head of gold, the lion with wings that soar. Again, I back up and I say, God, why have you given us all of these things? That declaration by Nebuchadnezzar is the purpose, so that all the nations of the world will recognize who God is. He's going to do what he chooses to do for his purpose, to accomplish his will. We can't stop it. And the plead is actually that we simply just accept it and accept him for who he is. Verse 5. And suddenly another beast, a second like a bear. It was raised up on one side and had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. And they said thus to it, Arise, devour much flesh. The bear is the chest of arms in silver, ribs in the mouth, devouring flesh. I don't know if you've ever seen a bear, but a bear is not like a cheetah. You don't see it crouching in the grass, watching the gazelle in the distance, and all of a sudden, silently, it just starts running. Quietly in the weeds, and it quickly catches up to the gazelle because it's so fast and so swift and smooth and is able to capture its prey. A bear can charge very fast for a very short period of time. So you better hope you're further than a football field away when he starts his charge. When we lived in Alaska, the church was on Swanson River Road, and just up from the road, if you went over the knoll, was a fish and game area. And the one spring, before the bears were supposed to be out of hibernation, a game warden was there, and he'd gone out checking some of the bear baiting quadrants that were up there. You could sign up for different quadrants, and then you could go baiting the bear. You'd put food out for the bear, and some would hunt them, some would take pictures of them, whatever. So he was out, he was checking all the markers, making sure everything was in place, because it was pretty soon that the men would start choosing their quadrants and signing up for them and getting them. And it was supposed to be long before the bears were out of hibernation. And let me tell you, after the wintertime, they come out very hungry. Typically around the end of May, when all of the moose are being born. And he's walking back down Swanson River Road towards his truck. And he's facing his truck. And he hears this thumping sound behind him. And he turns around and looks, and here is this brown bear, grizzly bear you would call it, brown bear just charging at him, head down, bobbing like this. Not up like the movies show. He's down and he's in full trot. And his head is just bobbing up and down. And it was so fast in that short distance, it was just, all he did was he just pulled his gun up and squeezed the trigger from his hip. He didn't know what else to do. You can't shoot him in the head because they've got a skull that's shaped like a scoop and it just ricochets off. Well, it happened when that bullet was fired. The moment that it got to the bear was one of the times he raised up his head to take a step, and it went right under the chin and into the heart and killed him. And that bear stopped feet from his toes. Killed. It was a big story. It was pretty exciting, actually, for me. Probably not for the ranger, but for me, it was pretty exciting to hear about all that story. But the bears, they can run fast, but it's just for a moment. They just charge, but they're big, they're awkward, they're ugly, they're not as fast. My dog and the neighbor dog would get around a bear and they would just run circles around it. And finally the bears would just give up and get tired of the noise and walk away. It wasn't fast enough. It couldn't move quick enough to get to the dogs. That's the idea of this bear. Suddenly this beast came up. He was like a bear. He raised up and he's already got the bones in his mouth. And there's all kinds of debate about what those 3 bones are. And I'm not going there. I can't even tell you. He's devouring, though. And the winds themselves speak to him that's coming from above and says, now, devour the nations. Swallow them up. It's the chest and arms of silver. This would be Belshazzar and Cyrus, Mede and Persians taking over Babylon. The next beast in verse 6, the leopard. After this I looked, and there was another like a leopard, which had on its back 4 wings of a bird. Now you have the graceful, swift, hunting animal. One that moves quickly and rapidly and has the wings, multiple wings as well, that is almost unstoppable. Swift and vicious, graceful with wings, spreads quickly, 4 heads. Interesting, Alexander the Great conquered so fast. He took over the known world in a matter of no time. He's the leopard. And after they put him to rest and he died, they divided Greece up into 4 regions. And that was the end of the reign of Greece. Rapid, fast, vicious, conquered quickly. 4 heads, and it's over. That's the belly, the sides of bronze that was described for Nebuchadnezzar years before. Verse 6. After this I looked, and there was another like a leopard, had on its back 4 wings of a bird, had 4 heads, and dominion was given. After this, verse 7, I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast. And it's interesting, this beast does not get the name of an animal. This beast, to Daniel, is indescribable. There is nothing that he can use to explain by way of an illustrated animal what this animal is. Dreadful and terrible, exceeding strong. It's a dreadful animal. Legs of iron and feet of iron and clay. This dreadful beast with the iron feet, the legs of iron and the feet iron and clay, dreadful, terrible, exceedingly strong, huge iron teeth, breaking to pieces, trampling to residue every nation. It's different than all the others. 10 horns and a little horn. Back to the text here, middle of verse 7, it had huge iron teeth. And it was devouring, breaking in pieces, trampling the residue with its feet. It was different from all the other beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. Daniel looks at this and he's considering this. It's an iron animal. He doesn't quite fathom that. And the iron teeth, it's gnashing all the nations, and it's crumbling all of them to powder. And then out of this beast comes these 10 horns. And he says in verse 8, I was considering the horns. I mean, it's kind of a matter-of-fact statement in the English. But imagine you seeing this kind of animal coming into your room. And all of a sudden, you realize these horns are there. Here's a metal animal with metal teeth gnashing the nations with 10 horns coming out. And Daniel's like, what? What is that? He's just taken back with that, considering it. And then he notices among all these 10 horns, there's another horn that comes up, verse 8. A little one. And it comes up among the 10 horns, before whom there's 3 of the first horns that were plucked out by its roots. So here's this little horn. It's like the opposite of baby teeth, right? You have baby teeth and they kind of come out and then the bigger one comes in. It's the opposite of that. You've got 10 horns, and in the middle of the 10 horns, this little horn comes out, and it pushes out 3 big horns because its roots overtake. It's got a deeper rooted strength to it. And it pushes out those 3 horns. And there in this horn were eyes, end of verse 8, like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking pompous words. Well, here's the beast. The beast is the nation. It's dreadful. Its legs of iron, its feet of iron and clay. It's Rome. It's a dreadful beast. And Rome devoured and conquered the known world. and the Roman system and the geopolitical state of the world today is still based on that Roman world. Still continues spiritually and politically in the world. It's a dreadful beast, but within that beast are 10 horns that come up, and then this one horn, and this is the first time we see this in all the beasts. It's a horn that is rooted in that creation itself of a nation. And it's one that comes out like a man. His eyes, he speaks pompously. Where was the last time now in recent history, talking about the book of Daniel, that we heard somebody speaking pompously? Right? Nebuchadnezzar. That didn't turn out too well for him. I can't fathom why Satan continues to try. I don't think he can not. I just don't think he has a choice. So we can parallel all of these animals with the image. So Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. Here's an image: the head of gold, the chest of silver, the waist and hips of bronze, the legs of iron, the feet of iron mixed with clay, other stuff in there. It's kind of earthly stuff that's easily broken, but there's still roots of that iron that's in the system, even today. And now he sees the beast in this dream. And you've got the lion that's the head of gold, and he's gone, and the bear that came, and we can easily see that. It's the Medes and the Persians. We can see the leopard that came, Alexander the Great, that conquered swiftly, but it was over quick, and then it was divided with the 4 heads of that leopard. And now the dreadful legs and the feet of iron and clay that remain. By the way, this isn't the last time that we see a parallel with these beasts. How do we know that this is the apocalyptic stuff in the end? The book of Revelation, John on the island of Patmos, we're going to look at, talks about the very same beasts and uses words right from the book of Daniel. So that's the dream. Look at verse 9. Listen for the contrast. Daniel says, I watched till thrones were put in place, and the Ancient of Days was seated. Imagine he's seeing all of these thrones, all of this political stuff going on. It's in the midst of the storm, and they're trying to gain control over everything, but the storm keeps raging. And all of a sudden, all of those thrones that exist throughout the world are taken and put in their place. And the Ancient of Days, one ruler, comes and sits before them. His garment was white as snow. The hair of his head was like pure wool. His throne was a fiery flame, its wheels a burning fire. A fiery stream issued and came forth from before him. This is an interesting contrast to the New Jerusalem and the throne of the King in Jerusalem. And out of that throne, from under that throne, flows the river of life. But right now it's a river of fire. He's already sitting in judgment here. 1,000 thousands ministered to him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. And the court was seated. And the books opened. We see these books come back into play in the book of Revelation as well. The books are simply a record of all things, from beginning to end. A book of God's record, of his plan, of how the winds have blown through the history of time. And there he sits, and I can hear the hush of the storm just calm right down. Almost like the storm when Christ calmed the Sea of Galilee. And instantly the waves stop with the wind being halted. And he sits on the throne, and everyone sits. And before him are the books that are now opened. The flame of fire coming out from underneath the throne. In verse 11, Daniel says, I watched then because the sound of the pompous words which the horn was speaking. I watched till the beast was slain. That dreadful beast. They had their dominion taken away. The body of the beast was destroyed and given to the burning flame, and as for the rest, the dominion was gone. Their lives were halted for the time, just for a season. And then he begins to talk about the kingdom. Revelation 19. I was watching in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man, coming with the clouds of heaven. And he came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. Then to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom. These things are important. The order in which they come. Here, all of the beasts are being subdued before the one who sits on the throne, the Ancient of Days. And then he sees the one coming, Jesus Christ. One like the Son of Man, who is now going to be presented before the Father. He does not yet have kingdom in hand. That's important. Certainly for some of the views that are out there. And he's given dominion and glory in the kingdom. So that verse 14, all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom the one which shall not be destroyed. Wow. Abrahamic covenant, the Davidic covenant, the Palestinian or the land covenant, the new covenant, now fulfilled. Daniel was grieved in his spirit in verse 15. And he's like, what does all of this mean? I came near to one of those who stood by and asked, verse 16, him the truth of all of this. So he told me and made known to me the interpretation of these things. Verse 16 and 17. Those great beasts which are four kings, which arise out of the earth. And we can track them. But the saints of the Most High shall receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, even forever and ever. Here's the interpretation. Daniel was told, let me give you this interpretation. First, there are 4 kings. They're going to rise. 4 kings that will come and take power. One from the one that was previous, and then the next one from that one, and then the next one from that one, until there is one kingdom that is the promised kingdom that will consume them all. And that is the kingdom of God. But the saints of the Most High, verse 18, will receive the kingdom. There is going to be a kingdom that will take over those 4 kings as the kingdom of the saints. The one that was promised to the nation of Israel. That one will last forever and ever, we're told. It's described for us all the way down through verse 25. We don't have time to read them all. And then in verse 19 through verse 25, it talks about the 4th beast and all the details that are there. 4th kingdom on earth is different than the others. It devours the earth, it breaks in pieces. 10 horns, 10 kings, arise another kingdom, and another shall rise with them and be different than the first ones. Subdue the 3 kings, he shall speak pompous words. He'll persecute the saints. Look at the end of verse 25. And he intends to change times and law. He is fighting the winds of God. Then the saints shall be given into his hand. For a time, times, and a half a time. This means 1 plus 2 plus a half. 3.5. In the first 3.5 years, he's going to rise to power. And the second half, he is going to take over. And it's going to be given to him for 3.5 years. But the court will be seated at verse 26. And they shall take away his dominion, consume and destroy it forever. Again, giving more details of what we've already read. Then the kingdom and dominion, verse 27, and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people, the saints of the Most High. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and all dominion shall serve and obey him. It'll be an everlasting kingdom that will put an end to all of the storm. The storm of life that has been raging since Genesis chapter 3. That tosses the humanity itself and its ability to reflect the image of God back and forth, beating us up and throwing us against things that we wouldn't plan and taking control of our lives away from us. It's all going to come to an end. And crescendo with this kingdom for the nation of Israel. That's the interpretation. Image, beasts, they're just kings that rise to power, the nations that come and devour the ones before. And the one that will last for a long time and kind of get intermixed with the things of earth, but it's still there, the iron, the feet of clay. Until there is a rock cut out by human hands, by God's determinate counsel, that is raised up, like in the dream of Nebuchadnezzar, and is cast at that standing image. And all the nations of the world will crumble before it. And that kingdom will consume all the four corners of the earth. The kingdom of God. Daniel draws a conclusion for us in verse 28. Here's the conclusion. I like Daniel. He got everything out. He drew all the main points that he needed to draw. It's an outline for us that parallels twice in this chapter, and it parallels chapter 2 as well. And he gets to the end and he goes, this is the end of the account. Talk about a conclusion for a major thesis paper, right? Okay, that's all I have. And he's done. As for me, says Daniel, now here's how it's affected me. And by the way, this is the end of the Aramaic. This was for the nations of the world to see, those that are outside of the nation of Israel to see. Here's God's big plan globally. This is what's going to happen. These are the powers that are going to be at play. In chapter 8, we pick up again the nation of Israel and its focus through Hebrew. Here's my thoughts. They greatly trouble me. My countenance changed, but I kept the matter in my heart. Let me give you 3 concluding thoughts. For God's people and the nations of the world, this should be troubling. Troubling to believers, certainly, because we look out at the nations of the world and they're lost outside of Jesus Christ. This is their end. This is coming. That judgment is coming. And the river of fire is real. And God will judge according to those books. It ought to be troubling to us as believers to know the people around us, that's their destiny. We say we love, we say we want to be loving. Do we really care? We've got to answer that question for ourselves. But even for the world itself outside of Jesus Christ, this ought to be troubling. The whole purpose of this was the same purpose that God had for Nebuchadnezzar when he sent him out for 7 years to be a vegetarian. And he said, for 7 years I ate grass, and then God gave me my mind back, and now I praise the God of heaven, and the world can't stand against him. This ought to be troubling to the world. In part, it's interesting, the end times thing, and it's certainly been popularized by certain preachers, especially over the last couple of decades. I understand all of those things are there, but it ought to be interesting to the world. It ought to be something that is troubling to them in their hearts. God has given this as a message so that we can help explain, listen, God's got an end coming. It's not going to keep continuing like it always has. And he said in the middle of verse 28 there, my countenance changed. I was going through life. I was doing my thing. I was obeying God. God was blessing me and honoring me. I was rising to power. I was doing what he said, and the blessing of the Lord was there, and he protected his people. All those things were great. And then I saw this. It changed me. It helped me to realize that in part, and this is Daniel, right? In part, he's still living here. But he said, even my countenance now changed. You can tell the difference between somebody who is talking to an unbeliever and they're just trying to beat them up for not believing truth. They're trying to prove them wrong. And someone who truly cares that they're lost. And I got news for us all. The world can tell the difference too. And Daniel's here and he says, look, even my countenance has changed. Daniel recognized, as we must recognize, we need to let this change us. Change our countenance. Change our outlook in life, our purpose. Why are we here? We're not just here to just enjoy getting together and enjoy, and all of those things are good. All the things that we do as a church is great, and the wonderful memories that we can help build with each other, the friendships that we have, but there is so much more to why we're here. The knowledge that these things are coming ought to change me from what I otherwise would be. And then Daniel said, I kept the matter in my heart. There are two facets of that. He took it to heart, which is what changed his countenance in the first place, because it was troubling him. Troubling him about the nations, about the known world to Daniel was coming to an end, and he knew it. Maybe not in his lifetime, but everything he understood and everything he grew to love was going to be gone. It changed him because of that. So he took it to heart. It became very personal to him. It wasn't something that was just going to be, but it was something that impacted him. It was personal. But there's another aspect to this that I never really thought about with this verse. He kept it there. It carries with it the idea that he continued to hold it in his heart. It wasn't just something that impacted him at that moment and boom, then it's gone. It was something that he held there captive inside of him. Not to hide, but to foster, to hold on to continue to carry with him wherever he went. It should be troubling, it should change you. And ultimately, we need to take it to heart and keep it there. It's easy once we go through a series like this, and it's interesting to look at the parallels. We don't always have time to sit down and draw these parallels. And it's fascinating to consider the things that are yet to come that, for all intents and purposes, the church is going to be out of here for. But it needs to have an impact in our lives. And we can't just now go back to 2 Peter, finish that up, go back to the book of Acts, finish that up, and just go on our merry way. Here's what we need to take to heart. I bless the Most High and praised and honored him who lives forever. All the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing. He does according to his will in the army of heaven, and among the inhabitants of the earth no one can restrain his hand or say to him, "What have you done?" And then we have the scripture reading we did this morning. There in Revelation chapter 4, I looked into the throne, which was surrounded by the sea of glass, and there sat the Ancient of Days. Take it to heart. Keep it there. Even though it's troubling, let it change you. Change your motivation. Change your outlook to life. Change your conviction and your motivation to be committed to Christ in your life. Let it change what you hold on to in this world and what you're willing to let go of. And like Daniel said at the end of chapter 7, when he gets to the end of all the message that he had for the nations of the world, here's the end. Troubling, changing. Hold on to it. Don't let it go. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you, Lord, for the message even of this redemption. Not just the redeeming of our souls from our sin, but the redeeming of all things created from the clutches of the curse. The moment when you calm the storm of life for the rest of eternity. Is it any wonder, Lord, why in the New Testament we're reminded, therefore, knowing the terror of the Lord, we persuade them. Lord, may this trouble our hearts indeed. May it trouble us so much that we can't help but change. Lord, may we hold it and keep it in our hearts and live according to it. For out of our heart flows our speech, our actions, our commitment, our love. So that we might, Lord, like the Apostle Paul, become all things to all people, so that we might win some to you. May it not just be an interesting intellectual exercise of putting the pieces of a puzzle together, but that which helps to transform us personally and permanently into what you want us to be. In Jesus' name, amen. Let's stand together as we sing this last song. The battle belongs to you.
Heavenly armor will enter the land that'll belong to the Lord. The weapon that's fashioned against us will stand. That'll belong to the Lord. We sing glory, honor, power and strength to the Lord. We sing glory, honor, power and strength to the Lord. The power of darkness comes in.
Father, we thank you, Lord, just for the image of your power and strength today. Your winds blow this life and our lives where it will. We can't stop it. We can't control it. Lord, we can surrender to it. For an accepting of who you are, there is safety. No wonder, Lord, that you call yourself for your people a place of refuge, protection, safety, peace. And in you, Lord, we can find rest. Help us to rest in the truth of who you are. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.